Hello, everybody. We're going to be talking today about the English Renaissance. The time period in English literature that we call the Renaissance era is roughly between around 1500 and 1660. As all literary periods, the borders are pretty fuzzy, and it's not like everybody woke up one day and said, "Oh, we're in the Renaissance," or something like that. It was more of a gradual transition, but over time you can see some pretty big shifts that go on in the culture and correspondingly in the literature. And so that's what we talk about when we're talking about literary time periods and also in general and the English Renaissance in particular. All right, so a little bit of background. Before the era that we're talking about, up till just a little bit before this era began, England had been involved in an on and off again civil war that we now call the Wars of the Roses. There's basically a conflict between two branches of the English royal family, the Lancasters and the Yorks. And even though the war itself is not like a particularly bloody one, because it involved the noble class, and the noble class at this time were, if you remember, pretty much the um, law enforcement and legal system. And so when all the legal system's busy fighting each other, let's just say that there's a lot of chaos and disruption. And I mean, the murder rate in England was sky high. And then you had these vendettas of people from one family killing off the other family back and forth. And so it's just, kind of the country descended into chaos as a result. So anyway, the Wars of the Roses ended when this fellow by the name of Henry Tudor invades England. He was from the Lancaster side, and he fights a battle with and then in the battle kills the current king at the time, who's Richard III, and takes the throne. Probably a lot of the people in England at the time just thought, well, this is just next phase in the war, and probably some Yorkist will come back and fight and everything like that, and we'll keep on going. But that didn't end up happening. Among other things, Henry Tudor was a really smart and clever sort of ruler. Not necessarily the most moral ruler, but he was really good at playing off different factions against themselves and making himself kind of the center of all webs, if you will. And among other things, he also marries the niece of the king who he, killed in battle. And so in some ways sort of unites both of the branches so that by the time he dies, England is very firmly in his grasp, and he's, built himself a pretty solid dynasty. His designated successor was, of course, his oldest son, who was a fellow named Arthur. Arthur had been groomed, all his life to be the next king and well prepared for it, so it seems. And among other things, his father decided to seek out for him an advantageous marriage. So he finds this Spanish princess, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel, the same ones that you know from the Columbus story. She was, I think, like their second or third daughter, something like that. And married, sought out her as a partner for his son Arthur. And so everything's looking good. Arthur marries Catherine, and then Arthur dies about a month later. And so Catherine's stuck there in England, and it looks like the throne is going to actually pass to Henry's second son, who's also named Henry, instead of Arthur. Well, obviously not Arthur because he's dead. And so the question is, what do we do with Catherine? The old King Henry considers marrying her himself, but that's just too weird for everyone. So instead, they agree that we should see about letting young Henry marry Catherine. Catherine's a few years older than he is, but the biggest real block to that is it was against the church law at the time. The church was the one who oversaw laws of marriage and such for a man to marry his brother's widow. Now, there were different levels of this type of law, and some of them were absolutely never, this is never okay some kinds of unions, but that wasn't the case with this particular one. This was one that was kind of like, we don't really approve of it, but if there's a really good reason, we can make exceptions. And so they sent off to the Pope and said, hey, you know, this union between dynasties will probably create a lot of peace and a lot of stability. You know, could we have an exception here? And the Pope agreed. He said, okay, yeah. The good coming from that kind of outweighs the negatives of a brother marrying his brother's widow. So the Pope agreed. And so Henry, either shortly before or shortly after he took the throne, I don't remember quite which, he marries Catherine. And yeah, this is the young Henry, Henry VIII. You've probably heard of the fellow. So he comes to the throne pretty young, marries his brother's widow. Early on, it seems like they're very devoted to each other, in fact. And he really likes Catherine, who's older than he is and probably somewhat wiser and more stable, if you will. But as time goes on, she seems to be unable to bear him a male heir. And that's kind of a big thing because there had been one time in history where England had, there had been an attempt to have a queen succeed to the throne, and it ended up in a pretty long civil war. This was, you know, hundreds of years before. And, you know, coming out of the Wars of the Roses, another civil war, the English, the last thing that Henry VIII wanted for his legacy to be was that they go back into chaos, because keep in mind that, you know, the Renaissance period that we're talking about now is really, a lot of it is in reaction against the chaos of the Wars of the Roses and similar things that happened before. So the absolute worst thing that you want to avoid is a civil war. And he's afraid that Catherine only has one child, and you know, it's a daughter, and he's afraid that if she attempts to succeed him, that it'll just end up in another chaotic condition. So anyway, at this time he's also kind of getting tired of Catherine for a number of other reasons as well. While she's getting a little older, and he's getting interested in some of the ladies in waiting. Now, it's pretty common for kings and other nobles of the time to have mistresses, but one thing that was definitely not okay was divorce and remarriage. That was against church law. Now, sometimes they would allow what was called an annulment, which was pretty much the church making a ruling that for whatever reason, like maybe someone married another person too closely related, or they married him under false pretenses, like lied to him or something, that this marriage didn't actually exist and that this was just a pretense of a marriage, so it's over, you're free to marry. Henry, based on the fact that he had married his brother's widow, sends off to the Pope and says, hey, Pope, I think y'all got this one wrong. I should not have been married to my brother's widow because I think God's cursing me, and that's why I don't have a son. The Pope at that time, however, was under the political domination of Catherine's nephew. And Catherine obviously did not want to be put away as a wife. And in addition, I mean, hey, they'd already ruled on this. So the Pope said, no takesies backsies, as they say. At which point Henry says, okay, well then I'm kicking out you, Pope, and I'm going to have my own church so that I can get my divorce. So yeah, he starts the Church of England at this point, and kicks out the Pope, decides he's going to start his own church, and starts the Reformation in England as a result. Now that's a rather controversial decision, to say the least. The Pope wasn't super popular in England at the time, but not being super popular, and then the king suddenly declaring himself head of the church and kicking out the Pope, there's a big jump between those two. As a result, Henry desperately needed to make a lot of allies really quick that would support him in this kind of private struggle with the Pope. So what he ends up doing is going around England and claiming that all the monasteries are corrupt. And, some of them were, but not, he wasn't, actually legitimately investigating them. Shutting them all down, seizing their land, and giving it to a bunch of buddies of his, which made them really rich and also made them suddenly very much on Henry's side, because they knew that the Pope would not like that either, but you know, Henry made them rich. Now there's a bit of a problem with that. The monasteries at this time, they were large landowners. They had large holdings, and so, you know, it made a lot of people really rich really quick when their land got seized and sold off and given away to these, you know, powerful guys. But the monasteries performed several very important social functions. They were the main, basically, welfare program in England. So if you were a poor farmer, and keep in mind most people at this time are still farmers, and your crops failed, you could go and at least get a meal or two from the local monastery, and that might keep your family from starving to death. And they might try to find you something to do and, you know, help you get through the lean times. They're also some of the main hospitals at the time. So if you got sick, yeah, their medical knowledge wasn't very good at the time, but they could at least give you palliative care, you know, feed you, wash you, take care of you. And in a lot of cases, that's really the main thing people need to survive illnesses. At least it very much raises their likelihood of surviving, even if they never get any treatment, just being taken care of. And then thirdly, the monasteries were a major part of the educational system. So we actually see education in England decline pretty dramatically after he does that. So it kicks out a lot of poor people. There's a lot more poor people just really desperate, and you know, it's just a whole lot of things get disrupted by him doing this. Needless to say, this caused a lot of resentment in a lot of places, particularly in the north of England, which was kind of more conservative and more traditional in some ways. And so a large group of nobles and peasants and others like that get together and they start marching to London as a large armed group. And they say, you know, their goal is not to overthrow the king, but they're going to kind of basically say, hey, king, listen to us. The king doesn't really have an army that can successfully oppose them. And so he's got to do some quick thinking. So he goes out there and meets them. And he says, you know, you guys have some great points there. I will definitely take that all into consideration, but, you know, don't do the rebellion thing. Head on home. I promise I will hear you out. So the leaders of this rebellion that became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace all go home. And then the king tracks them all down, rounds up their leaders, and chops all their heads off. So yeah, that sort of guy. And of course, famously, he was not the greatest husband either. Not only did he divorce his first wife, Catherine, and then go remarry this lady named Anne Boleyn, well, after a couple years, Anne Boleyn has the same problem. She only has daughters, or actually just one daughter, and not a son. So this time he changes it up a little. He decides to accuse her of adultery, and let's just say that there's no solid evidence that was really the case. I mean, possibly, but you know, it looks like he was pretty much just looking for a way to get rid of her. So he chops her head off. And then he marries his third wife, Lady Jane Seymour. And this time he gets a son. Yay! And then Jane Seymour promptly dies shortly afterwards. So he's free and single, looking for wife number 4. So he sends off to this German princess named Anne of Cleves, decides he's going to marry her. But there's one problem. When she shows up in England, it turns out that, let's just say, the portrait painter might have been a little bit too flattering. And Henry takes one look at her and says, And so quickly, she is basically put away and divorced. And he's free to marry the 5th time. And so he marries this woman named Catherine Howard, daughter of a really prominent family in England. But by this time, I think he's in his 50s, and she's about 18. And he's really gross. He's like so fat that they have to, I think, cut out part of his table to accommodate him, and he's just kind of bloated with all sorts of various problems that he has. And let's just say that she finds a charming young gentleman in the court a lot more interesting than the king. King finds out about her adultery and promptly chops her head off. And then he marries his final wife, Catherine Parr, who manages to survive him. So anyway, and here's a little rhyme that can help you remember what happens to the wives of Henry VIII. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. All right, so Henry VIII finally dies. and passes the throne to that son of his, who's only 9 years old at the time. That son becomes known as King Edward VI, and he dies by the time he's 15. So Henry did all that to his kingdom, to his church, to his people, all in order to get a male heir who doesn't ever even live to the age where he's actually able to run anything. So, it's one of the times where you kind of say, wow, it's kind of karma in history, if you will, in a way. So when Edward dies at a pretty young age, his sister takes over. Now, during Edward's reign, I should backtrack a little bit. During Henry's reign, he did kick the Pope out, makes himself the head of the church, and shuts down the monasteries. But he doesn't really change the beliefs of the English church all that much. He pretty much agrees with the Catholic Church on all the doctrinal matters, except for he just wants to be in charge instead of the Pope. And he wants the chance to go seize a bunch of land from the monasteries. But he doesn't really change the belief situation that much. When he dies, however, and his son Edward takes over, the ministers who are actually running the country are a lot more radically Protestant. And so they take England in a much more radically Protestant direction, kind of to go along with some of the Calvinists, if you will, that are in mainland Europe at that time. And so during the 6 years or so of his reign, England takes a pretty dramatic turn away from the older Catholic type beliefs, even if they were technically kind of their own church at that time. They were still pretty much Catholic in their beliefs up until that point. So when Edward VI dies, there's an attempt to get another Protestant monarch to reign, his cousin, I believe, Jane Grey. But that fails, and pretty much all the people rally around Henry's daughter, the one of the first wife, who he, put away. Was a woman named Mary. So Mary becomes the Queen of England, and needless to say, she wasn't super happy about her dad divorcing her mom, and because he didn't want her to reign. And also, probably for personal preference as well, she's very, very devoutly Catholic. So she decides she's going to reconcile England with the Pope, throws out Edward's changes, and decides she's going to go back full-bore Catholicism. Now, at first, she does so, tries to do so somewhat peacefully at the first, but things, there's some resistance and pushback, and she gets really angry, and then she just goes full-bore persecution. She starts burning Protestants left and right, and that's why she becomes known as Bloody Mary. And so, yeah, after a few years, she dies of smallpox, and so that leaves the throne to be taken over by the next sister, who is the daughter of Henry's second wife, the one he beheaded. And so that daughter's name was Elizabeth, or as she became known as, quote unquote, Good Queen Bess. Now, the truth of the matter is, that she was every bit as bloodthirsty as her older sister. She was just a lot more subtle and a lot more careful about how she did her killing. So, because Henry's first wife was still alive when Elizabeth was born, she was not considered legitimate by official Catholic Church law. And so she's not very likely to be happy with kind of the Catholic direction that her older sister took the country. So she goes back the other direction, not quite as radically as her brother Edward is during his reign, but definitely swings back that way. And as a result, instead of Protestants getting rounded up and burned, now it's Catholics, mostly the influential ones and any priests that she can get her hands on that are getting executed. But remember how I said she was a little bit smarter in the way she did it? Well, one of the ways that she was smarter is instead of killing them as heretics, she instead says, oh, they're traitors to the throne. And people were much more sympathetic to killing people for that reason. And the death penalty for heretics was burning, but for traitors to the throne, it's drawing and quartering, which is basically they tie them up and pull their guts out while they're still alive, chop them up into pieces, put the pieces on poles around, and let it rot. And to let everybody know that this is why you don't cross the queen. So yeah, she does that to, I mean, the general rule is if she catches a priest one time, she banishes him from the country. If he shows back up again, then she draws and quarters him. And she also executes a number of, important officials who are, noblemen who are Catholics that she thinks might challenge her. She never marries. She flirts with a number of various suitors on the continent, which kind of keeps any of them from invading her for a while. But eventually, her older sister's husband, Philip I of Spain, decides to get together this large fleet and try to invade England. And keep in mind that at this time, Spain is pretty much the most powerful nation in Europe, whereas England is, I mean, it's not nothing, but it's definitely considered a second-rate power. It's not anything on Spain's, level. But the English, with their Dutch allies, defeat the Spanish Armada. So it's this huge celebration and outpouring of, national pride that, hey, we, the little English Navy, we beat off the most powerful nation around and, sent them packing. And so, that obviously helps her popularity a lot too. She also does things like forms a spy network. So she has spies all over the place watching people and, kind of turns England in some ways into a surveillance state where they're, that she's got listeners everywhere and they're making sure that everybody is on her side, and she's really ruthless about rounding up and getting rid of people who aren't through any means. In addition, she knows that if people tell stories that make her look good, that's going to help her too. So she's a big patroness of the arts, in particular the new theater that's coming on. So there's a lot of really, really strict censorship on the theater because she wants to make sure it's portraying her and her family in a good light. Okay, so anyway, so that's Queen Elizabeth. When she dies, the throne goes to her cousin, who is actually at that time King James of Scotland. So he becomes known as King James the First and Sixth because he's King James the Sixth in Scotland, but he's the first King James in England. Now, England and Scotland do not become one country. They're still seen as separate countries. They still have their own separate legal systems, separate parliaments, and all that kind of stuff, but they have the same guy at the top, and that's King James. He manages to be clever. He's not really popular, not nearly as popular as Elizabeth for sure, but he's popular, but he's clever enough that he stays on the throne amid some kind of discontent and such. And so he does a number of things that he's known for to posterity. Among some of them, he's the King James of the King James Bible, for one. So he commissions a new translation of the Bible that becomes very popular, one of the biggest influences on the English language ever, in all honesty. And he's also the King James of Jamestown in Virginia. So this is when the English start founding colonies in the New World during his reign. When he dies, his son Charles takes over, and Charles has a lot of the same problems his father does, but unlike his father, Charles is kind of an idiot. He's not very clever, and so he ends up just kind of like bullheadedly ramming his head against the Parliament and his opposition. And at this time, a lot of the opposition in Parliament is led by a very radically Protestant group known as the Puritans, who want to go far further, towards, say, Calvinism and stuff than James and Elizabeth and also Charles had been willing to go. Eventually, Parliament has it with him, and they start a civil war. Charles loses the civil war. Parliament tries him and chops his head off. And so at that point, Parliament takes over for a while. Parliament is pretty incompetent. and they don't do a good job running the country. So eventually, the general of the most successful parliamentary army, this guy named Oliver Cromwell, takes over and pretty much runs England as, well, not pretty much, he runs England as a dictatorship. In the process of running England as a dictatorship, he has wars with Scotland and Ireland. And in Scotland, he defeats the Scots, and they agree to his rule. And it kind of leaves it there. In Ireland, on the other hand, he invades and basically goes on a rampage. And some people consider what he did in Ireland to be the first modern genocide, because he kills close to 1 million Irish. Let's just say that if you talk about Cromwell to this day in Ireland, he is not a well-loved individual there. So, yeah. But he is incredibly competent. He's very good at what he does. He's also a very successful general and all that kind of stuff. However, when he dies, his plan is to, pass the rulership, not really throne, to his son Richard. But Richard is, once again, nothing like his dad. He's very incompetent. So after, trying that for a little bit, the generals in the army all decide they're going to go welcome King Charles the First's son, King Charles II, back as king. And that's what they call what's known in England as the Restoration, and that's pretty much what is considered the end of the Renaissance period in England, is the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. All right, so that's kind of your brief historical overview. Now we're going to talk about some of the big ideas and such that are going on at the time. Okay, so here's a big concept, chaos versus order. Remember how I talked about the Wars of the Roses and how they led to a real breakdown in law and order? Well, that had been going on, similar things like that had gone on in a lot of places in Europe. And the idea was, wow, we really need order. The desire for order was so strong that people were really willing for folks like the Tudor monarchs, they were pretty absolute monarchs and could be definitely tyrannical at times. But people were so sick and tired of the chaos and anarchy that they were willing to go along with that. And in fact, there is a famous philosopher from around this time known as Thomas Hobbes. He writes a book called Leviathan. And I should just mention that the term Leviathan is actually a term from the Bible about this really horrifying monster. And so his idea was basically, anarchy is so terrible that what we need to do is get the meanest, scariest guy, give him all the power, and even if he's brutal and brutally represses everyone, at least we don't have everybody fighting everyone else. We just have one guy to watch out for, and that's a better situation. So it's obviously very dim view of human nature and stuff like that, but I mean, it's a little bit hard to blame him of that view given what he'd seen. Before this, a little earlier than this time, we have an Italian writer by the name of Niccolo Machiavelli. He writes The Prince, and basically he argues that because chaos and civil war and unrest are so terrible, and it's like the worst thing ever, the prince, that's just what he calls his ideal ruler, is justified in lying, stealing, murdering, doing any immoral thing necessary to maintain authority. Because as bad as those things are, it's better than anarchy and chaos and civil strife. So yeah, this is a pretty common sort of view. Keep in mind that, a lot of people think of the medieval era as, oh, the kings were absolute monarchs and stuff. And I mean, if you were right there in the presence of the king, yeah, you definitely didn't want to get on his bad side. But the truth of the matter is the king's power very often didn't extend much beyond him just actually being there. And there was a lot of powerful nobles, and there was also the church that, very much was a check to the king's power. The nobles and the church, and then various local groups and stuff like that. So medieval monarchs were, for the most part, very far from being absolute monarchs. However, during the Renaissance period, well, in England, the English, kicked out the Pope, and Henry declared himself head of the church. So he kind of, basically, he's removed the church as any sort of counterbalance to his power. so he can ignore them. At the same time, he cuts down to size a lot of the older nobility by, giving a lot of this, empowering a lot of these kind of newer nobilities. So he kind of dispenses with the nobility. A lot of that's helped along by some of the new military technologies, which we'll get into later on. So Henry and a lot of other rulers like him at the time, they remove a lot of the old checks and balances, and they become very much more absolute monarchs than what previous monarchs had been. Eventually, kind of the Parliament in England becomes sort of the counterbalance to the absolute power of the monarch, so much so that, like I said, eventually they even chop a king's head off. And so sort of checks and balances kind of reassert themselves at that point. All right. So I'd mentioned some of the new inventions. So the big one, obviously, is the printing press. Printing press starts in the mid-1400s. I think it's the 1470s is when the first printing press in England starts up. And keep in mind that before the printing press, I mean, there have been some other innovations, such as the invention of paper, that made books considerably cheaper and easier to obtain than they'd been, say, hundreds of years before, but they were still very expensive. A single copy, for instance, of the Bible, it would be enormous, for one. It would be this enormous volume. I mean, well, you can't really see it in this picture, but I mean, the size of, like, it would, if you opened it on one of your school desks, it would go off either side. It's that big usually, and be very heavy. And it all had to be hand copied, and that wasn't the only expense. The ink was not cheap for all that hand copying, and in addition, all the paper and binding wasn't cheap either. Now, printing doesn't necessarily make the paper and the ink any cheaper, but it does definitely cut way down on the time of just handwriting it. So suddenly books become far less expensive. And so we really see the ability for mass literacy to occur that had not been the case before. And so you see, I mean, still the majority of people couldn't read and write, but you see a much higher percentage reading and writing. And that really fuels things like the Protestant Reformation and other stuff like, the beginnings of kind of, not really the scientific revolution yet, but, kind of the forerunners of that. Information's able to spread a lot quicker and to a lot larger group than it had before. And that just really accelerates a lot of these other changes as well. Sailing technology. Europeans would never have reached and colonized the New World had they not invented new ways of creating ships and sailing across. Because keep in mind, most ancient ships, the idea was you stayed pretty close to the coast. You didn't really ever want to sail too far away from shore. Because you didn't have a good way of navigating, for one, or necessarily the right kind of sails and the right kind of ship that would hold up in the heavy seas that you get in the middle of the ocean, as well as they didn't quite have down how to store food properly and stuff like that. So all those things, a lot of new technology came online around this time and made possible things like, well, settling the New World. So that was obviously a huge change. Military technology. Gunpowder had been in use since the 1300s to a limited degree, but it's during this time period that it really comes into its own. Gunpowder offered a few advantages. It wasn't you could still definitely shoot a bow faster than you could use the kinds of guns they had at that time. But those guns were a lot better at going through armor, and probably even more importantly than that, the guns didn't take nearly as much training. So instead of someone having to practice archery basically since they were a kid, you can round up a bunch of miscreants, because that's a lot of times who they had in their armies, is basically people who it was either a choice of join the military or get hanged, and stick a musket in their, or an arquebus in their hands, give them about a month's worth of training and send them off to the battlefield, and they perform all right. Couldn't do that with things like bows and swords and such. So it really changed the dynamics. And now, rather than needing to depend on people who trained for military service their whole life, like the old noble class, the kings could just kind of, if they have enough money, they can hire themselves an army, spend a little while training it, and they can beat, the old-fashioned knights and military class. So this really dramatically increases the king's power over their nobles and such, and among other things. You have the beginnings, like I said, first steps of the scientific revolution. Copernicus early on in this period, and then Kepler and Galileo a little bit later in the 1600s. All of them, held that the Earth goes around the sun instead of the other way around. None of them were able to actually prove that at the time. It wasn't proven until after their death. But they start a process of looking at the world from a different perspective than it was kind of the received knowledge at that time. And even though they couldn't necessarily always provide solid evidence for their theories, they at least got people thinking along new lines and started kind of shaking things up. And then, of course, there's the big one of the New World. I mean, this is just has a dramatic impact on things like the way that Europeans saw the world. Even the way that they understood things about human beings. There were a number of things that had been thought to be universal to all human beings until they find a group of human beings in the New World who had no contact with, their older ways of doing things, who didn't hold those same values. And so suddenly there's kind of a shakeup of, oh, I guess those things aren't universal to human beings. It's such a shock that some of the early explorers even came back to Europe and said, we don't even know if those people are actually human, because they behaved in ways that were so different to how they were used to and organized their society on such different lines. So this was mostly not really the English at this point, because they were kind of latecomers to this colonial game. This is the Spanish and Portuguese. And so they go and they decide to put the question to the Pope. And so the Pope sets a bunch of theologians looking into it and philosophers and stuff. And they come back and they say, no, they're absolutely human, and you have to treat them like humans. Of course, they went and ignored that and enslaved the Indians and treated them absolutely awful anyway. But one thing that did start was, because they're dealing with a totally different group of people, it starts actually the idea of international law, and that there are things that should not be allowed even against other people, people that aren't in your, kingdom or nation, and that there should be limits to the way we do stuff. So that really starts a lot of that. And then, of course, you have all the new foodstuffs. So it's fun to think about what Italian food had to have been like before the New World, because they didn't have tomatoes. So you didn't have, tomatoes in sauces and stuff like that in Italy before the New World. You didn't have potatoes in Ireland, because potatoes come from the New World. Peanuts and peppers and a whole bunch of other, new crops come in from the New World, as well as, just it opens up new routes for trade. So it really changes a lot of things. You actually see the impact of the discovery of the New World in some of Shakespeare's plays. In particular, The Tempest is deeply influenced by that. But you can see some of it in Hamlet too, which is what we'll be reading. Okay, religious upheaval. I've already talked about this some, and how that happened kind of in England. It was a bit different on the continent. So this is the era of what became known as the Protestant Reformation. On the continent, it was much more ideologically driven, at least at first, among the early leaders. In England, it was much more politically driven. And I said at least at first, by leaders such as Luther and Calvin and others. They were definitely driven by, ideological reasons and disagreements that they had with doctrines of the Catholic Church at the time. However, political stuff shows up pretty quickly afterwards, because they kind of do the same thing that Henry did in England to get nobles on their side. Say, hey, you can go seize this monastery and church land and make you really rich. And so some of the nobles joined because of, out of genuine conviction, but there's a lot of them that also join because it's a quick way to get rich. And so their ideas spread through places like Switzerland, parts of France, throughout a lot of Germany, Scandinavia. So it tends to be Luther more in the northern areas and Calvin more in the southern areas, and then also in Holland. But they become very influential, and eventually their ideas cross the channel and start and having an influence in England as well. Although, like I said, with the English Reformation, it was kind of more top-down, politically driven by the king. Another branch of the Reformation in Europe is what became known as the Radical Reformers, and some of them were like straight-up revolutionaries. You call them like there's this group called them that became known as the Munsterites, who took over a city and basically just declared a communist state, said all things were in common. Unfortunately, they also considered their wives things, so yeah, all wives were held in common as well, and a number of other things like that. Both the more moderate Protestants and the Catholics joined forces and quickly came and took that city and wiped them out. There were more peaceable individuals, however, also in this Radical Reformation. One of the groups that came from that was the group known as the Munsterites were called Anabaptists, but there was another group of what were known as Anabaptists that became kind of the ancestors of people like the Amish and the Mennonites, and to a certain extent Baptists, although that's a little bit more complicated because there's kind of influences from a couple places there. So anyway, a lot of that gets started around this time as well. So there's a lot of upheaval in Europe. Keep in mind that Western Europe, although divided into different nations, had pretty much a common culture. Yes, there's different languages and there's definitely differences of culture, but at least if you were, a wealthy or an educated person, you could travel to pretty much any part of Western Europe at this time, and you could speak with the other people of your class because you knew Latin. Now, most of the reformers knew Latin too, so that didn't really change. But you also had a common kind of religious and philosophical viewpoint, and that really does change. And so Europe kind of, as a unified culture, breaks apart. And that doesn't really ever in a lot of ways come back, and there's a lot of wars as a result too. Eventually, there's an attempt at what was known as the Counter Reformation by the Catholic Church. So it's the foundation of the Jesuit order, and they also supported a number of Catholic monarchs and said, hey, we need to get our house in order and correct some of these things because the Protestants are making hay with some of the problems that we have. And so there was an attempt to kind of retrench, reformulate, and they did end up taking back some areas, particularly, say, in Germany and France, where the Protestants had made a lot of inroads. And anyway, it became known, like I said, as the Counter-Reformation. All right. So now we're going to talk about literature a little bit. So poetry is, at least early on in this period, well, probably pretty much throughout the period, is considered the highest and most important form of poetry, of literature. It becomes known as, quote, a manly accomplishment. So if you were an accomplished man, you would be really good with a sword. You would dress very fashionably, and you'd be able to write a pretty darn good sonnet. So yeah, they had a little, that was considered with them, a manly accomplishment. Yeah, things are a little different. Oh, and their dressing up included lots of lace and makeup and stuff like that. So that was considered very manly too. So anyway, like I said, some of those things have changed over time. An individual who was kind of held up as the perfect example of manly accomplishment was this fellow named Sir Philip Sidney, because he was a very accomplished poet. He was a successful soldier, and he actually died fighting the Spanish. So he was held up as this sort of paragon of an English Renaissance man. A lot of set forms get developed in English at this time. I say get developed in English. Most of them were actually imports from other languages, but they were adapted to work for English. Best known example of that is the sonnet. Sonnet was actually an Italian form of poetry, 14 lines following a particular rhyme scheme and iambic pentameter. And but the English adapted it in a few different forms, and sometimes they just used the old Italian form too. And this was very successfully used by people like Sir Philip Sidney. His were kind of unusual because they were iambic hexameter instead of pentameter. And then obviously Shakespeare as well. He becomes kind of a master of the English sonnet. There is, later on in the English Renaissance, there's an epic poem. The most famous epic poem, at least in, the type of English that we use today. Beowulf was in Old English, and it's not really comprehensible today. But in stuff we can read today, what's generally considered the greatest epic poem in English was written during this time period, and that was Paradise Lost by John Milton. It was towards the end of this time period, and kind of, I think he started writing it during the time period and then kind of into the next one. But he was pretty much considered a Renaissance writer, even though he was still alive after King Charles came back. At this time, there's no copyright law. So what that means is you can write whatever you want, and the printer doesn't, and if the printer gets hold of it, they can print it up as much as they want, and they don't have to give you a dime. Now, if they want to stay on your good side, they might give you something, but ultimately, legally, they don't have to. They could pirate it, print it all off, sell it as far and wide as they want, and you don't get a dime. So as a result, a lot of writers were people who were already independently wealthy, didn't have to depend on their writing for money. But a number of other ones would depend on wealthy patrons, where they would basically a wealthy person or someone with a lot of political clout, like say a king or high noble, would agree to pay them a big chunk of change, and if the poet would keep writing good poetry and probably also say some flattering things about them. So Shakespeare does that in some cases. Or at least he was looking for a patron at one point, although plays were actually one of the few places that a writer could make a living without a patron, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Edmund Spenser, his main patron was Queen Elizabeth, and he was a little bit before Shakespeare, overlapped some with the early Shakespeare. And so that's my wife in the background. You can say hi to her. So that's Mrs. Tyndall there. And so Spenser wrote this really long poem known as The Faerie Queene. It was another epic. And it's pretty dense and difficult to read today, but it is still in an early form of modern English. So it is readable. It's just, you got to really wade into it some. And then, of course, John Milton, who wrote the Paradise Lost that I was just talking about. All right, so prose is also an important literary form. They don't really have the novel per se at this point. That really doesn't come into English as a literary form until the next era after King Charles comes back and stuff. But you have collections of essays that are really important. So in French you have Michel de Montaigne, and in English you have Francis Bacon, who writes a very influential set of essays on various topics. Religious writing is huge at this time. One of the most popular forms of writing is known as the spiritual autobiography, which is pretty much an individual telling the story of their struggle with sin and kind of how they came to understand religious truths and stuff like that. And there's also treatises, which are really popular, which is pretty much, we're going to talk about this. And then you have a lot of what we call polemical literature, which was literature calling out this other group, a lot of times religious groups. This was a very religiously passionate time, and there was a lot of stuff written about how that other group is all bad, and let's just say they didn't hold back much. I mean, they had everything in there. all the bad words, all the slurs, all the stuff. I mean, it was all fair game. You read stuff now, and yeah, it blister your ears reading some of the things that these groups said about each other when they weren't actually out there killing each other. So it was pretty violent words and violent actions both. And then cartoons, some of them pretty obscene, written about political or religious rivals. Happened a lot, actually. Now these would have been hand drawn, not really printed at that time, but you know that showed up a lot. Okay, drama. So now we're finally getting around to Shakespeare's real wheelhouse. The public theater, the first public theater in London opens in 1576. This is slightly before Shakespeare is really writing plays yet. And this is really made possible. Remember back when I said that Henry had kicked out all of the monasteries and all that kind of stuff? Well, one of the results of that is there's a lot of poor people on, with really nowhere to go. So a lot of them end up in London, just kind of looking for a way to make a living since they've been sort of kicked off their farms and stuff. Oh, another thing that happens during Henry and Elizabeth's reign is these wealthy nobles who now have power, they start kicking off the small farmers and just running sheep on their land. And so there's a lot of people with nowhere to go and that are very poor. A lot of them come to London. London's population during the reign of Queen Elizabeth swells from about 30,000 at the beginning of her reign to I think 500,000 by the time she dies. So enormous increase in population. And how this connects to theaters, we'll think about it a little bit. A really small town or even a small city is going to have a hard time supporting a full-time theater with people that is what they do for a living. So now Kerrville, there's a lot of wealthy patrons and stuff like that. So we managed to do pretty good for a city of our size. But keep in mind that London at the beginning of Queen Elizabeth's reign was not much bigger than Kerrville as far as population. But then it swells all the way to the size of something like Corpus Christi by the time she dies. And with that larger population, you have the ability for people to be full-time playwrights and full-time players, and you can go see a play at pretty much any time of the year, or at least any just fairly often. It becomes a fairly common source of entertainment. Now it's important to remember that these big public playhouses, which are the ones that Shakespeare wrote for, they were mass entertainment. Shakespeare was writing for all classes in society. So we put in some kind of jokes and clown tricks that maybe the less educated sort would really appreciate, as well as a lot of blood and gore and stuff like that. But then he'd also put in some really sophisticated language and thought that his more educated viewers would appreciate. And so you have all kind of levels. Now, later on, you get some of what are called chamber theaters, and these are kind of smaller, more private theaters that cater to a much wealthier audience. And you also get these things called child troops, which would be associated with some school or something, and it'd be like all these kids putting on plays. And they're actually super popular at the time, and the professional playwright, the professional actors really kind of had a beef with these kids who were taking all their business at times. Shakespeare was not the only playwright. In fact, there's a number of successful playwrights. One of the earliest ones was this guy named Kidd, and then kind of early contemporary of Shakespeare's was a fellow named Kit Marlowe. And then later on, and towards the end of Shakespeare's career, and then going on after Shakespeare's death, this guy named Ben Jonson. And some of these people were really about as popular as Shakespeare at the time, particularly, Jonson and Marlowe. They were super popular. The difference is that, while we still know about their plays and still read them, Shakespeare's have just stood the test of time a lot more. I don't know at the time if he would have been considered the most popular. He would have been, up there. He was definitely well appreciated and well liked at the time, but he wasn't Shakespeare in the way he is today, kind of head and shoulders above everybody else. That really only happened over time. Now, eventually, when the more radical Protestants known as the Puritans took over in 1642 after they chopped the king's head off and all that kind of stuff. They shut down all the theaters because that was one thing they objected to. They thought the theaters were evil and stuff like that because the theaters had a disreputable, were seen as pretty disreputable. For one, they were in the part of town that, let's just say, other types of entertainment were taking place, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what type of quote-unquote entertainment that might have consisted of. And in addition, it was seen as somewhat it was seen as somewhat iffy to be putting on plays in general. A lot of them had a lot of really rude humor and sexual jokes and violence and stuff like that. So they were pretty controversial. And so when these Puritans took over, they shut down the playhouses and they didn't open up again for 20 years. And so that kind of really chopped off English drama at that point, and it only kind of gets restarted later. Okay, so now a little bit about William Shakespeare himself. So he's born in 1564 in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon. So he's a country boy because this is kind of a country town. His father, however, was a pretty prominent person in the town. Not a nobleman, not super wealthy, but, you know, decently well off. He was a tanner. Shakespeare marries at the age of 19 to someone who's like 9 years older than he is, or maybe even more than that. I mean, yeah, no, I think she was 9 years older than he was. And their first kid's born 6 months after the marriage, so let's just say it might have been a bit of a rushed affair, them getting married. We don't really know we don't know a huge amount about his early life, but we know at some point he came to London, and we don't know really what he did there for a while, although it seems he got kind of connected to some of the big playhouses. And next time he really surfaces, he's already writing plays. He starts writing plays sometime in the 1580s and continues writing them all the way into close to like 1608, 1609, I think. When he retires, and then he dies a few years later. He wrote for he wrote for a broad audience. He wasn't writing just for the upper crust or highly educated people. He was writing for the common people and the educated people. Queen Elizabeth watched his plays, and then just the average person who would pay a penny and stand because they couldn't afford to actually get the places where you could sit down, stand and watch the plays. He collaborated on some of his plays with other playwrights, and we've actually, in recent years, discovered that there are some plays that weren't originally realized that Shakespeare was a collaborator, that, you know, we're pretty sure he actually wrote parts of them now. Anyway, so he didn't write them all on his own. In addition, the vast majority of the stories he told were not stories he came up with. They were him retelling using his own language and you know, rewriting them in his own language and such, older stories that he'd found somewhere else, some from history, some from, you know, various like little novella type things that were written, and sometimes other plays as well that he would adapt. So for the most part, he didn't come up with his own ideas for stories. He adapted other people's ideas. Anyway, but he made them usually way better than the original because he was brilliant in his use of language and dramatization and such.